Hello and welcome to this guide on how to return to Kerbin from the surface of the Moon in Kerbal Space Program 2. So in this video we're going to launch our Kerbals off of the surface, we're going to rendezvous and dock with a command module in orbit, and we are going to return them back home safely. So as you can see, we've already got our flag in place, we've done everything we need to do on the surface, so we're going to quickly board our Kerbals back into the LEM and then we will get straight into the tutorial. So once that's done, the first thing we want to do is we want to retract the ladder, and then the next thing we are going to do is we're going to establish which way the command module is travelling. So because we entered into orbit in a free return trajectory, that means that the command module is actually orbiting in a clockwise direction, whereas if you enter into a normal orbit, then it would normally be travelling in an anti-clockwise direction. And the reason that is significant is because if it's travelling anti-clockwise, you'd need to launch to the east, but because we are travelling clockwise, we're actually going to launch to the west, which makes it slightly less efficient. It's due to the rotation of the moon, but this launcher has no problem getting back into orbit. So now we know that we're going to be travelling to the west. The next thing we would do is we would ordinarily want to right click on the descent engine and deactivate it, and then we would go to full throttle and stage the top half. However, there is a slight problem with that at the moment, given that the game is currently in early access, and I will just show you what that problem is. So we stage, start moving our rocket westwards. If we then go onto the map, you can see that when you stage a two-stage lander from the surface, it doesn't actually bring up your trajectory line, which is a problem because we need the trajectory line to be able to rendezvous and dock with the command module. So I'm going to quickly reload the game and I will show you a quick workaround just to get our trajectory line to show up again. So the way to get the trajectory line to show up is we are going to actually leave the descent engine on. As you can see, we do have a little bit of fuel still in the bottom stage, so we won't need to worry about having to either transfer some fuel across from the top. However, if you don't have that option, you can actually go into settings and there is an option to add infinite propellant. So you can do that just to get off the surface. I believe you do need a little bit of fuel in the bottom stage to be able to do that, but it's worth testing. Generally, when I do this, I always have a little bit of fuel left over. So we'll resume the game, and the way to get our trajectory line to show back up again is we're going to increase the throttle ever so slightly to lift the entire lander up a little way off of the surface. We're then going to hit X on our keyboard to cut the throttle. We will stage the top half, press Z to go to full throttle, and that should bring up the trajectory line. So we'll go through that now. Like I say, we'll lift up just a little bit off of the surface. Once there, X, stage Z, pitch down towards the horizon, and then if we go back onto the map, you can now see that our trajectory line is there. So that's just a nice, quick, easy workaround to get the trajectory line to turn back up when you are launching a two-stage lander from the surface. So because there is so little gravity on the surface of the moon, we are going to pitch to roughly around about 10 to 15 degrees from the horizon almost immediately after takeoff, because then we will start building our trajectory, our apoapsis, and also extending our suborbital trajectory. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep an eye on the apoapsis, and when it reaches somewhere in the region of 40 to 50,000 meters, we're going to cut the throttle. So 44, 45 should do the trick. And the reason for that is our command module is currently travelling at around about 74.6 kilometers from the surface, and we want to create a lower orbit than our command module. The reason we're creating a lower orbit is because the command module is currently ahead of us, which means that we will be travelling faster, and therefore we will gradually catch up to the command module. However, if the command module was behind us, we would actually create a higher orbit, so it is travelling faster than us and it could then catch up to us. However, I usually try and go for a lower orbit, given that that uses less fuel. So next we're going to create our circularization maneuver. We'll focus on the moon by right clicking on it and hitting focus. we will then place a maneuver node as close to the apoapsis as we can. It's usually better, if you can't get it bang on, it's usually better to have it a little bit before. Then we're going to create the maneuver plan, click near that, and pull inwards on the retrograde arrow. And the reason I pull inwards on the retrograde arrow instead of pulling outwards on the prograde one is because you get a little bit more fine control. It's just easier to make sure that we don't overdo it. Obviously we do have plenty of time, so if we do overdo it we can just recreate the maneuver again. Now, one quick tip which I've only recently discovered myself is when you mouse over your periapsis or apoapsis, it brings up this little window to tell you what we're doing. And what we can do is we can actually right click on that and it will bring up this little symbol, which means that that window is now locked. So when we mouse away it doesn't disappear, and that just makes creating maneuvers a little bit easier. So we're going to try and make our maneuver around about 45,000 meters. There we have 45, which means that our projected apoapsis will be 46.2 and our projected periapsis will be 45.4. You can mess around to try and get that almost perfect. Usually I try and get them around about 90 degrees from the maneuver node, but it can be a little bit fiddly, so we're just going to leave it around there and that should do the trick. And then if you want to get rid of this, all you need to do then is just right click on it again and that will unlock it. So now that that maneuver is set up, we're going to hit the maneuver button on the SAS control bar, and that will just lock our command module or our lander towards the maneuver marker on the nav ball, and then we're going to hit the warp to maneuver button on the burn timer. And once there, it'll stop at around 30 seconds, and I usually like to just warp forward a couple more notches just to get to around 10 seconds and save a bit of time. We can see it's going to be a 3-second burn at 49, so once the timer hits 0 we're going to go to full throttle and then cut the throttle pretty much straight afterwards. And because we haven't quite matched our orbit to the line, we are going to just increase the throttle ever so slightly and just try and match our orbits. So that's pretty close. So that means that our actual orbit will be a periapsis of 46 by an apoapsis of 47. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to make sure that our orbital inclination is matched to that of the command module. So we'll right click on the command module, set that as the target, and as you can see our inclination is at 0.8 degrees difference. So to fix that, we are going to create a maneuver node on the ascending node, which is the next node on our orbit. We can do it on the descending node if that's the next one, but as you can see it's the ascending node at the moment. We'll create a quick maneuver plan, and because it's the ascending node I know we want to pull either outwards on the anti-normal arrow, so AN equals anti-normal, or inwards on the normal arrow, so I'm going to pull inwards on that. I'm going to use the descending node to judge what our projected inclination will be, and there we have 0 degrees. Now that's ready, we can once again hit the maneuver button on the SS control bar, and once that's stabilised we'll warp to the maneuver, and it's a very, very small burn, so we're not actually going to use full throttle, we're just going to use very partial throttle to get to what we want to get to. And I usually watch the burn gauge to make sure that we're actually stopping at the right time. There you can see we now have a 0 degree relative inclination. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create a intercept maneuver to be able to intercept the command module. So we'll just place a maneuver node anywhere on our orbit. Then we're going to either once again pull in with the retrograde, or pull out with the prograde arrow. I'm going to pull in as usual until our orange projected orbit line matches up with the grey orbit line of the command module. Once that's done, you'll see these markers come up, and that tells us our first and second closest points of approach. So to try and get them as close together as we can, we're going to pull the maneuver node around our orbit until the two match up. And you can see they're getting pretty much close there, so we're going to quickly check to see what our projected distance will be. Once again, right clicking locks it, and that gives us a 1.1 kilometer distance from the target, so we're going to leave it as that. We are once again going to hit the maneuver button. We're then going to warp to the maneuver, and this is a 1 second burn, so we'll use once again partial throttle just to make sure that we don't overdo it. When the burn gauge hits the bottom, we'll press X on our keyboard to cut the throttle. So that means now that our actual distance from the target will be 1.3 kilometers. So the next thing we'll do is we can either manually warp forwards to get close till our two ships get close together, or what we can actually do is just click on our orbit at any point and time warp to that point. It's usually good to do it nice and early so that we have plenty of time to make any adjustments that we need to make. So now the two ships are back together, I'm going to press home to focus back on our ship. Like I say, they're fairly far apart at the moment, however if we go back to the flight view, we should be able to look around, and theoretically we should be able to see the target ship, and there it is, 4.2 kilometers away. So the next thing we need to do is we need to hit the velocity bug until that turns to target, and you can see our current relative velocity is 15 meters per second. So we know it was around about 1,000 meters apart that was the closest point of approach, so we're going to very carefully warp forwards until this marker reaches about 1,000 meters. And while we're doing that, we are also going to hit the retrograde button on our SAS control wheel. It won't change just yet, but as soon as we stop warping, then the lander will automatically adjust itself to point towards the retrograde marker. So now we're at about 1 kilometer apart. We'll stop the warp and go to normal speed. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to increase our throttle until the target velocity reaches 0 meters per second. So once again, it's best to use partial throttle for this so you don't end up overdoing it and flying in the opposite direction. And we did go a little bit further there, but the way to fix that now is we are going to use our RCS. So I have this set so the RCS thrusters are currently turned off, but I've got them bound to a action group, which is action group 1. So now I've pressed 1, we should have RCS control, and we can use either H or N to just adjust our target velocity to 0 meters per second. So now that we are basically flying in unison or in formation with the command module, we're going to hit the target button on the SAS control bar. That will point our lander towards the command module, and then we're going to press H on our keyboard to increase our throttle or increase our relative velocity to about 2.5 meters per second. And now you can see we have the green prograde marker on the nav ball. What we want to do is we want to get that inside of the white target marker, and personally I like to orient the ship that we're trying to dock just to make it a little bit easier and more intuitive to be able to line the two markers up. And now that they're lined up, that means we are heading straight towards the command module. So it might be tempting to go faster. You can go up to about 10 meters per second. That's the fastest I would recommend going when doing any kind of rendezvous maneuver, because you don't want to go too fast, because then the faster you're going, the harder it is to slow down and the less responsive the controls will be. So it's better to go around about 2.5 meters per second and then just carefully warp forwards until the two reach around about 150 meters apart. As you can see, while we're warping, the prograde marker is actually changing, so we're going to need to make sure that we change that or adjust that before we carry on once it's reached about 150 meters. As you can see, it's currently trying to fly below us, so we're going to stop the warp. That was around 200 meters, and then we're going to use I on our keyboards just to bring the prograde marker down back into the target marker and make sure that we are flying straight towards it instead of at an angle. And once this marker hits 150 meters, this little symbol should disappear. So there we go, which means you can now see the command module nice and easy. And we're going to slowly just head a little bit closer. And once we get to about 50 meters now, we're going to try and stop our approach. So we're going to aim to get our target velocity down to 0. So now we're at 50 meters, we'll line up the green green prograde marker, and then we will hit N on our keyboards to reduce our velocity to 0 meters per second. Now, as you can see, the command module is currently facing away from the lander. So what we're going to do is we are going to use the square bracket button to move to the command module. We're going to activate SAS, and we are going to right click on the docking port of the lander and set that as the target. And then on the SAS control bar we can hit the target button, and that will just face our command module straight towards the lander. We're then going to use square bracket to get back to the lander, and this part isn't strictly necessary, but you can actually do the same thing and right click on the docking port of the command module, although as you can see it's not highlighting, so we're going to just leave it because the two are now pointed straight at each other. So we're going to then use H on our keyboards to increase our approach speed to around 0.2 meters per second. We're going to use the warp button to get them nice and close together, and as you can see, once again the prograde marker has moved ever so slightly. So once we get to around about 5 meters, we're going to, or about 7 in this case, we're going to shift it. We are then going to use our RCS to adjust our prograde marker and make sure that the two are pointed straight at one another. And as I said in my Rendezvous and Docking tutorial, it's always better to take your time when doing anything like this and go nice and slowly, because if you go too fast then you'll either end up crashing into the target ship, or you might, spin around it and lose control. So as you can see, the two ships are getting closer and closer together. And even though everything's travelling at ridiculous speeds in space, it's always better to go slowly, because then you have more control over what you're doing. And there the two ships are docked. So now they're docked, we're going to quickly shift our Kerbals back into the command module. To do that, you go to this little symbol on the right hand side of the app bar, hit the Kerbal manager, and we're just going to bring Edwin and Bill back into the Gumball command pod. So now that is ready, the next thing we are going to do is we're going to right click on the command module and make sure we are controlling from there. And because we don't really need this anymore, we don't need the command module anymore, we're going to reactivate SAS, go to either the normal or the anti-normal arrow, and we're going to ditch the lander. So to ditch it, we'll just right click on the docking port and click undock. And it's always best to undock something from... It's always best to undock in either a normal or an anti-normal angle, because then it's going to throw it away from our actual trajectory and we won't end up crashing into it at any point in the future. So we'll make sure we are on the command module. We will go to our retrograde button, just in preparation of our, actually no, we need to go prograde, don't we? Sorry, prograde button, just to make sure we're prepared for the escape maneuver from lunar orbit. So to get back to Kerbin, we'll go onto the map and we will place a maneuver node somewhere on our orbit. It doesn't matter where. I'm going to place it just behind us. Then we're going to pull inwards on the retrograde arrow to extend our orbit. And the general rule of thumb here is, because the moon is travelling in an anti-clockwise direction, we want to be burning backwards towards where the moon has just come from, because we're trying to get in towards Kerbin. If we were trying to get out towards Minmus, for example, we'd want to burn in the other direction, but we're not, so we're going to burn inwards. So we will extend our orbit, or our projected orbit, until it leaves the moon's sphere of influence. Then we're going to just move the maneuver node around a little bit to try and see where we can get to the closest. So that looks pretty close to me. And generally we want to try and leave the moon's sphere of influence somewhere around where the orbit line resides. So we'll keep moving our maneuver node around, and we are aiming to get our periapsis in the region of around about 20 to 25,000 meters. So we'll aim for 25,000 meters, which is around about there. That'll do the trick. And now that is ready, we can point our ship towards the maneuver marker on the SAS control bar. We can then fast forward to our maneuver, and once there, we're going to quickly pause the game and make sure that everything is set. So we'll check that the main engine is on, which it is. Everything is in the right position, and now we can start the game again. And once the timer reaches 0, we will go to full throttle and create our return maneuver, or perform our return burn, should I say. Now, as our orbit starts to get bigger, we're actually going to reduce the throttle so we don't overdo it. We're going to just try and match up the orbit lines on the map. So I did overdo it ever so slightly, but that doesn't really matter. What we can do is we can just activate our RCS and play around with the N and H keys just to try and get our apoapsis back up towards around about 25,000 meters. There we go, that's the return maneuver set. So what I'm going to do, because it takes a little while to get back to Kerbin, I'm going to fast forward the video during the next bit, and then once we get towards Kerbin I will pick it back up and talk you through what I do next to land nice and safely. So as we are warping, we don't want to warp too far, otherwise we'll either hit the atmosphere way too early and burn up, or we could end up skipping through it. But we're going to get our altitude to roughly in the region of 250 kilometers, sorry. When we're there, we can now position our command module either towards the normal or anti-normal arrows. And just as we did with the lunar module, the reason for this is so that we are going to kick the service module away from our orbit or our trajectory, so that we won't end up colliding at any point during the descent. So now everything's set, we will detach the service module. We'll then hit the retrograde button on the SAS wheel. And although it's not necessary, I just like to orientate the command module. And the next thing we'll do, we'll quickly fast forward. We'll make sure, even though we are going to be coming in over the sea, we'll just make sure that the altimeter is set to ground just in case. And once we hit around about 70 meters per second, or 70 kilometers, sorry, 70,000 meters up, we're going to go back to normal time. We are going to stage the drogue chutes, and you can tell that they're staged because they turn blue. That means that just when they reach the correct pressure, they will automatically deploy, and we don't have to worry about doing that manually. So you can see that the drogue chutes have already deployed. Now what I've done is I've actually designated an action group. In this setup I have designated it to Action Group 2, and what that does is once we reach around about 1,000 meters, we're going to hit 2 on our keyboard, and that will cut the drogue chutes and deploy the main chutes. And that's not strictly necessary, it's just something I like to do for the look of things, because it looks a bit strange having the drogue chutes and the main chutes out at the same time. But like I say, that's more of a personal preference. So you can see at 2,500 meters the drogue chutes deployed, and now we've hit 1,000 meters. I will activate the action group. Now the main chutes have deployed, and that will bring us down to a nice steady 8 or 9 meters per second. We don't want to be landing much faster than that, because especially if we are landing on the ground, then we could blow up as we hit the surface. And splashdown. So yeah, that is the way that I generally like to get to the moon and back. If you haven't seen the other videos in this little tutorial series, please feel free to watch them. But I hope that I have managed to teach you a few little tips and tricks that I use that I find make playing the game a little bit easier. And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to like and subscribe, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.